The next keynote essentially slide is let's take this to the next level. Let's drop a stack of lockboxes on the right-hand side of the display. We'll add a wedge on the left-hand side of the display. And then we'll use a timer to drop 10 balls in a sequence that hit the ramp, bounce off the ramp, and hit the stack of the lockboxes. So that if we just start out with one ball, you need if you want to code this from scratch, you'll want a folder with if you want to use that wedge, the wedge image, you want to use the lockbox, then the lockbox image, and then the magic ball image. So you need, if you want to do it all with images, you need those three images inside of a folder. This is a physics app. We need a ground for everything to rest on. So maybe start with a ground, which is just a rectangle down at the bottom of the screen. So in Drawn2Code, I usually move that down below the bottom, or at least I want the ground to extend below the bottom so that on a taller, like iPhone 5 size screen, you'll see ground all the way to the bottom. And then you can obviously color it anything you like in terms of grass color or dirt color or whatever. If we want to start physics, we could do that now if you haven't already done it. And then I want to add the ground as a body and switch it to static. If you're using a recentish version of Drawn2Code, then you should be able to name the rectangle if you can select it. So I'll just call it ground, and I'm just doing that so that in the stack it's a little easier to read what's going on. All right. So we could run this now. It's not going to do anything, right? It's just got a brown rectangle that'll sit at the bottom. That's not fun at all. So we want to drop the wedge. Maybe let's do that next. So the wedge is an image. It's called Iron Wedge if you've used my version of it. And again, you don't have to. You could use just a polygon. Any of the polygons that have an angled surface that you can deflect the ball in a direction you want. I'm going to resize it a bit so that it works for what we're doing. And we'll play around with the size. In the version that you can download, I've also rotated it using a snippet, which you can do or not do. It doesn't really matter. Or you can leave the wedge kind of over here to the left. I'm going to let it drop just because it's cool to see it drop and land. If you don't want to do that, you can just set it kind of on the ground. You could even make it static. We do run the risk, depending on the settings, that when the ball hits it, it's going to shove it off the screen, which is not the worst thing. But if you don't like that, you can change it. Okay, so there's the image. I'm going to add it to the physics engine using add body. And I'll leave it dynamic. So we could run this. Let's run it. Draw. All right. So nothing super exciting. If you missed it, it was just the wedge starts out where it is and drops under the force of gravity. It bounces a little bit on the ground and then settles. So now we want to drop the stack of lockboxes. So let's load the lockbox image. And I'm going to resize it to make it a little more appropriate maybe. Okay, and then I'm going to leave it there for the time being because the next step is to create a timer. And then I'll move the image into the timer handler. And then I'll add the lockbox to the physics engine inside the timer handler. That just is the fewest number of steps if I do it in that order. You could not follow that order and still get it to work just fine. Okay, so the timers. The timer's an action. So if we want to add a timer, we want to head to the actions palette here. About 2/3 of the way down is timer, so I'm going to select timer. The default timer that you get is a timer that only runs one time after a 1 second delay. So we want to drop 6 boxes, so I'm going to change the 1 to a 6. In the timer settings panel here where it says repeat, I just changed that 1 to a 6. Every second is fine, so at least for now, I don't know if I would want to hurry it up or slow it down. We'll just see how it goes. All right, so if we go back to the stack, what you'll see is this has given us the timer object down at the bottom, and then the timer handler, and a default snippet for the timer event. So I'm going to move the lockbox. I'm going to hit move image to function, and then I just want to make sure I'm selecting the timer handler, which is the only function at this point in the stack. All right. So, I mean, just stopping and thinking about it at this point, what this will do now is every second create a lockbox image and place it, where the XY coordinates say it should be placed, which is off screen above the top of the screen to the right. So if you stopped it and ran it right now, you wouldn't see anything any different. The timer would be running. It would create 6 lockboxes, but they're off screen, so you wouldn't see anything. So we want to add those as physics bodies as well. So just like we did with a tap to drop example a few minutes ago, I'm going to select the lockbox. I'm going to head back to physics. I'm going to add body, the lockbox. And again, if you follow my sequence, identically, that will have put the add body statement into the timer handler, so that will get 6 lockboxes created, each one added as a body to the physics engine, so that it will drop under the force of gravity and stack up, maybe. And so this is where we'll see what kind of work it takes to get this to stack. Any questions while that's loading? After all that saying how difficult it is to stack crates up, the default settings seem to work pretty well for this size. You might have to adjust the size, you might have to adjust the bounce, you might have to adjust the friction a little bit. But if everything worked out well, you should be looking at a screen with a wedge and a stack of 6 crates. Any other questions? The next step will be to drop a ball. Yeah, I mean, sometimes Java can be weird about what has focus. So you can always click out of the app and then click back on the app, or click on a different object and then click back on the one that you really want to have focus. Okay, but balls. We need some balls. Let's start step by step. Let's just drop 1 ball. To do that, I'm going to go back to display objects. I'm going to load the ball image. Somehow I didn't get my project folder set correctly. Yeah. And I'm going to move the ball off screen here. I'm going to also resize it a little bit. And I'm just positioning it so that if it drops straight down, it's going to hit the angle of the wedge. So however you've placed the wedge or edited it or sized it, just kind of line up roughly on your screen so that the ball dropping straight down will hit somewhere on this angle that will deflect it into the stack of crates. And then we want to add that to the physics engine. And let's just keep the default settings the way they are and see what happens. What this should, okay, so let's see what happens. Well, so a few things. The ball dropped when the app started, which is fine. That's essentially what we coded it to do. But if it does drop then it'll hit the wedge and deflect into the lock boxes before the lock boxes have stacked up. So we've got a little bit of a timing issue. And then if you watch closely the ball bouncing around, once again, the physics shape is odd. So I'm going to head back to the physics shape, which for me is object 12. And I'm going to change it to use the circle radius and update the radius size so that should fix that issue. We also want to change it so that the ball isn't dropped right away. Before I do it, think, are there anything come to mind in terms of a technique that we could do to drop something, say after 5 seconds or so, instead of dropping it right away?
You could add a timer.
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, this is what the timer is made for. It's perfect. You could also, timers are awesome. I don't even want to imply that you should dislike timers, but if you develop some sort of an irrational dislike for timers, you could also change the Y value for the magic ball and place it way above the screen. If you give it a 1,000 or more pixel lift vertically, it'll just take a lot longer to drop and hit the wedge and hit the balls. Of course, it'll be going faster. So if that's an effect you're looking for, that would be a technique. But let's do the timer. Let's do the timer one because that gives you great control. So it's an action. It's a timer. We want it to repeat one time, but we want to give it, let's say 5 seconds. So I'm changing the delay to 5,000, which is 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds. Okay, and if we look back at the stack, that's given us, let me get that on screen, it's given us a second timer, a 1 repetition timer, and a timer handler, and a default snippet. So I want to move the magic ball and the add body statement script objects into this object 14 handler. So again, I'll select them and use the move into function, and I just want to make sure I'm picking the correct timer handler because now I've got two timer handlers, and I want the right one, which is the object 14 timer handler. And then the add body, same thing, select it, hit move resource into function, select the object 14 timer handler. So if you do that, your stack should look like something like this. You've got one timer that drops 6 lock boxes, and then you've got a second timer that waits 5 seconds and then drops a magic ball. So the combination of fixes work pretty well. The ball appears to be behaving like a ball. It's resting pretty close to the ground, and it certainly bounced and deflected like the physics shape is right. If you have any doubts about that, again, you head to your stack, go to setup physics, and turn on hybrid draw mode. And when you do that, you'll see in addition to the images, you'll also see the outline of all the physics shapes, and you'll also see them changing color when a collision occurs or when they're in motion in the physics engine. And yeah, the ball looks perfectly round, certainly close enough. This is essentially the drop 1 ball version, and we're going to upgrade it and drop 10 balls in a second. Anybody else? Yeah.
Is there a specific trick to figuring out the radius you should set on the ball, or you just kind of guess and check?
Well, it should be based on the size of the object itself, which if you resized it, it could be about anything. Mine ended up at about 64 by 64. So that's the overall width or the diameter. So we want the radius set to half of that roughly. So in the ab body, we should get something around 32.
Okay.
Now visually, that is a little big, and you can see that there is a little bit of room around the edges of the image that are transparent. It looks like so, and you can kind of see that because I don't know. It looks, if you zoom in, it looks a little bit like it's hovering a bit off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, it ends up being, it's just something you play with. If that bothers you, which it bothers me, then you go in and you'd say, okay, well, what would 30 look like? Would that give me the look and the behavior that's closer to what I want? And that's the same with all of this. It's you can play around with the physics settings even if they don't really make great physics sense, but they end up giving you the behavior that you want on screen. And so yeah, 30 looks probably better for this design. The other issue is, like I said last time, what we tend to do, or certainly I tend to do, is I keep tweaking stuff. I'll decide maybe that ball needs to be slightly bigger or slightly smaller, but then I'll forget to update the ad body. So you have to go back and update the radius to match whatever changes you made. You can hit the refresh button and it'll try to guess the radius, but it'll just do it by getting half of whatever the width is, which may or may not be perfect for what you want. So that's dropping one ball. So the activity essentially says, well, let's drop 10. How would we drop 10? So that's pretty much the easiest change in the world. We'll go to the timer and we'll change it from 1 to 10. So that'll drop 10 balls. It will do it every 5 seconds, which at this point you might want to think about not waiting, 5 seconds for each one. Let's see what 4 seconds looks like. So you want to give the stack enough time to more or less settle so that the first ball doesn't wipe it out. So this will keep running, obviously. And so there's lots of stuff to see that I don't really like. One is the friction on the ramp is too low. It's sliding off to the side. The balls also don't seem to have a whole lot of effect on the stack. So it looks like instead of knocking the stack over, it's going to knock the wedge off of the ground. So there's all sorts of stuff to play around with. So for the wedge, I'm going to crank up its density and its friction, try to get it to stay in place. And the ball, I'm also going to crank up its density a bit and its bounce a bit and see what that does. And I'm not necessarily looking for anything exact to happen. I'm just playing around with the settings to see what happens when you change these properties that are now at your control to get different stuff to happen on screen. There we go. So with a little bit of effort, you should be able to, for instance, get the stack to get tumbled, or if that's not what you want, to get the ramp to do something, or to get the balls to collect in some area, or whatever it is that you want. Anybody else stuck? Any questions at all?